Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Lexie Smyth. I'm the fiction category manager here at Barnes& Noble, and with me today is Jenna Seery, who's the associate producer of our Poured Over podcast, and we are thrilled to be in conversation with Jessica Soffer, the author of our February book club pick, This is a Love Story. If you sent questions via the Eventbrite page, Jenna and I have them. You can also submit questions via the Q&A module, which Jenna and I will be moderating. And as a reminder, this is going to be a conversation with spoilers. So if you haven't finished the book, you can always come back later, as this will be posted on the Barnes& Noble YouTube channel. So now that we've got the housekeeping out of the way, let's talk about the book. Jessica, I would love to know which aspect of this story came first for you. Was it the Central Park motif, Abe's voice, Jane's voice, something or someone else's voice? Where did this come from?
Um, there's a pretty simple answer to this question, probably because it's surprising even to me that I worked with just Abe and Jane for 3 or 4 years before any of the other characters' perspectives came in, including the character of Central Park. So for many years, it was just them. And I really thought that the book, the published version of the book, was going to be this very small niche book that just chronicled their relationship from beginning to end from the perspective of Abe. And it wasn't until probably 4 years in that I realized that it was too narrow a scope and too limited. And that's when all the other perspectives came in. But it's so funny now because it does feel all these characters have become so important to me. I think they live in the minds of other people too. And so to imagine this book without them feels really sad and devastating. But that's the truth of it.
So you actually, I think you just answered one of my other questions. So the Central Park chapters, the park
Mhm.
is a character. That is Central Park speaking.
I mean, I think so. I really like voices when they're not nailed down, and I like this kind of communal voice. And I think it's Central Park. When I think of Central Park, I think of this kind of somebody asked me what exactly the voice of Central Park is. And the more that I think about it, so I grew up very close to Central Park. My father took me there a lot as a child. We sat there, we observed. I spent time there with my mother too. It was the place where we went as a family. And as my father got older, we continued to come back there again and again. And he witnessed the park over many, many decades of his life. And he was this really non-judgmental person and just a really astute observer of the world. He was an artist. And so when I think, and it's only now that I feel this way, it's only kind of in retrospect. I certainly wasn't writing his voice as the perspective of Central Park. But in retrospect, I have this sense that it may be him as this kind of keen and unjudgmental observer of so many things over so many years.
I love that.
It's
I
funny,
love
it's one of those unintentional things. I didn't mean for that, but it may be true. It may not be true.
It's beautiful, though. I love it.
Thank you.
and I love the fact that each of the different perspectives sort of gives us a different angle into the story. Some feel like omniscient narrators, some feel very close to the character themselves. And something that I always love about books told in multiple POVs is when those voices really feel different. And I think that really comes through. I knew exactly when I was reading Abe. I knew when I was reading the Central Park chapters. I knew when I was reading with Max. Can you talk a little bit about sort of crafting those voices?
I'm glad that you feel that way because as a writer, at least for me, the really distinct perspectives are a gift in terms of craft, in terms of time. And so I really love being able to go into a perspective and feel like it is really apart from the other ones and that I won't be confused in my head and that the reader won't be confused on the page. I'm working on another book now and it's four mothers and they're all relatively at the same age. They live in the same town. They're going through the same traumatic experience and the experience of motherhood, which is sometimes traumatic and sometimes not. And I find that that's much harder to kind of keep separate. It's much harder to keep them distinct in their own way. But certainly these and not only are the characters, the perspectives in Love Story distinct, but they also move POVs. So they move from second person to third person, I have to say it was just a joy to write in that way.
I really loved the sort of unconventional way that you structured this. It feels so much like we're in memories, we're in these snippets and vignettes, and so many people in the Eventbrite, wondered sort of how this story came to be. And I wonder that we're unintentionally and intentionally left with so many blanks as we go through. We're missing these moments. Do you create those moments to fill in for yourself, or are you sort of like, I'm just telling what I'm telling?
That's such an interesting question. It's a question I've not even asked myself. I think I fill in all that I feel is necessary and I leave the rest up to the reader. It's sometimes can be tricky with tricky and also joyful with book clubs and talking about the book after it's done because I'm asked questions that I don't necessarily know the answer to. And I feel like there's this dance that happens between reader and writer. And I like for that dance to happen. I like for the reader to have their own feelings about things, their own curiosities about things. And I like to leave space for that, just in the way that I really like reading in that way. I like these books that offer a little bit of obtuseness and a little bit of abstraction so that we can kind of bring our own perspective to it. The reason that I read is to see a little bit of myself on the page. And I think that's why a lot of us read is to sort of feel less alone. And so I like the idea of somebody coming to a piece of work and saying, oh, I see this in me. I can imagine this happening for me. I can imagine this happening for the character. But I think when everything is spelled out, it can be harder and harder to find yourself in that way.
Lexi kind of preempted me on this one because we loved talking about Central Park in this book. We loved talking about New York in this book. That there's just such a joy in the way you describe these different scenarios and these different characters and how they interact. And it really does feel like even bigger than Central Park, New York City is a character here as well. And I wonder if you could talk about choosing to set the book there and also sort of the transition as well to the setting in Orient as it goes on.
Um, I love Central Park. I am a New Yorker. I spent the first 30 years of my life in New York with only a brief stint elsewhere. I think Central Park is a truly exquisite place and so surprising. It feels like such a heart and it's so protected. You walk into Central Park and the air literally changes. The temperature is actually different, which is pretty radical. And I think we move so fast in New York City. And so to go into the park and to be shifted like on the physiological level is really an incredible thing. And for me growing up, that's like part of my DNA. The Central Park, we lived in a tiny apartment. Central Park was my backyard. And I learned so much about the world spending time there. I learned about, regulating my nervous system from Central Park. So it's really a special place to me. And I also think that everybody has their Central Park. I think everybody has a version of that place that kind of slows you down, allows you to observe. Um, I don't even remember your question now. What was your question?
Just talking about the character's connection to Central
Oh,
Park and then moving outside of the city later on as well and how that affects them.
okay. So I also think that this book is really like a kaleidoscopic view of a nuclear love story. And so it follows these two characters and then multiple characters for 50 years. And a huge part of a 50-year romance can be location, it can be atmosphere. And for these characters, just like for me, just like for my family, Central Park really is a witness. It bears witness to their lives, the most momentous moments of their lives. And I feel like paying tribute to that part of a love story is as crucial as paying tribute to any other part of the love story. And then I think part of it too is that I wrote a lot of this book, and I certainly wrote all of the Central Park sections during COVID. And I think during that time, a lot of us were really dreamy. I know people were having very vivid dreams. I certainly was. And I spent a lot of time thinking about Central Park and imagining what the park was like at that time and wondering what the future of the park would be. And so it felt like a really sort of preemptive nostalgia to talk about the park, not knowing what would become of it. And also during that time, I was living near the water in a town very similar to Orient, and it felt like a kind of dreamy counterpart to Central Park. And I think that's where Orient came in. It felt like the characters needed a shift. Central Park couldn't be everything all the time. There needed to be a little bit of development.
When we first meet Abe and Jane, when they're, starting to remember their relationship, one of my favorite parts, is the way that Jane's creativity inspired Abe to try his hand at writing. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about what inspired that aspect of their relationship, because it's such a key part of their relationship throughout the novel.
That's such an astute question, and it's part of the book that nobody's really asked about. I haven't really talked about that much, and I too feel like it's an important part in their relationship. And I think that at their core, they're fundamentally different people. I think that Jane is a writer an artist by heart. In her core, the way that she sees the world, the way that she negotiates and organizes the world is through art. Abe is different. He's a much more functional human being. Like he is the one who pays the bills and does the dishes and kind of allows them to live in the world and not just live in art. And I think any relationship requires both. And I think that they sort of come in and out of success and success and tragedy, one and then the other, one and then the other as their relationship goes on. And I think that she wouldn't have had success without the backbone of Abe, and Abe wouldn't have had success without the wild sort of wide sweeping creativity of Jane. And so I think that they rely on each other in different ways at different moments for different things. And it just kind of goes back and forth in that way. And it's really a wonderful thing to be able to develop a relationship. I mean, as a writer, certainly as a human being as well, but as a writer, to be able to develop this relationship over 50 years is a gift. You can really see the kind of road race that is a long-term romance.
That is so wonderful. Another part that really stuck out to me was when they're talking about Jane's postpartum depression. It was really visceral, and something that really stood out to me was at the end of one of the chapters, Abe admits that he didn't really know how badly she was suffering.
Mhm.
And that seemed, of course he didn't, but I would love for you to talk about writing that dynamic too, because I found it fascinating. For two people so in sync, for him not to know.
I think that there's sort of a gender gap to respond to this question. I think that women experience postpartum in a way that I'm not sure men really ever could. I think that women experience motherhood in a way that fatherhood is very different. And I think that despite the fact that they were a really good couple, and I really do believe that they were. Their relationship was deeply respectful and reciprocal and supportive. But I think that the one thing that she couldn't share with him, or maybe the one thing that he couldn't understand, was the hormonal shift and the kind of compromise that she felt with having to give up her art, which is just sort of a natural response to giving birth. Like, I think as a mother, you become the default, regardless of um, how available your partner is. And so I don't think Abe could have understood. And I think that that's the experience of a lot of women, is despite how supported they are, there is a way in which motherhood is very, very singular to a mother.
I really found your descriptions of this period of time for the characters so like gut-wrenching to read, but also it was a time of such hope in certain ways as well, especially when it came to Abe's mother and the dynamic that she was able to bring. The relationship between Abe's mother and the family was one that really stuck out to me. And I was hoping you could talk about writing her and how influential she is in the family, even when she's not physically present.
Mhm. Um, I think, over my years of living, I've seen the way that one person can sort of save a life. So I think that for people who have tricky family situations, I've often seen that having one really special grandparent or having one really special teacher or one really special friend can make things all right again. And I think at a time when Jane felt really, really broken and really, really unseen, there was this woman who kind of surprised her with her capacity to hold space and to hold her and to understand the very distinct and very particular experience of motherhood. And I think in certain ways, I wish that for all mothers. I mean, I wish that for all young mothers, women who have just had children. I feel like they should all have this kind of um, guardian angel, someone to watch over them after they've given birth, because I think it can be a really hard time. I was fortunate enough to have a mother nearby who, took really great and special care of me. But to think of Jane sort of out on her own, sort of spinning without a mother and feeling very unseen by Abe, she really needed someone. And I mean, it sounds funny to say because I did create Bubby, but I'm so grateful that Bubby was there.
I agree. I think that it was like a relief to read
Yeah.
through, and especially for in relation to Max as well. Those so many characters, I think, just had that relief when she was there.
I think also I've had some conversations with friends about the ways in which they couldn't understand Jane's experience. They couldn't understand that kind of complicated feeling about one's own child. I was really lucky. I didn't suffer from postpartum depression or anxiety, but I do understand how it really shifts it shifts everything from underneath your feet. And so um, I think that having a support system is so essential, and I think that when people sort of struggle with Jane's experience, I want to say there is no one way that we experience motherhood. And it is almost, I mean, I think almost across the board, it is never easy. And everybody experiences it in a different way. And especially for somebody who, you know, um, lives her art so seriously, and feels like at every step art is being compromised by having to care for a small child. It felt important to offer that up as one experience, not necessarily mine and not necessarily anybody else's, but one that could potentially happen.
I agree. And I think on the spectrum of maybe complicated experiences in the book, I would like to segue over into talking about Alice. I think that, I mean, Lexi and I were talking, and we really commend the way that you've written her because I think she could really be seen as a villain or as someone who was really hard to connect to. And I know some of the viewers had questions about including her as well. But I think you wrote her in a way that really shows how young and naive she is and explains how she has ended up in the situation she is. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about choosing to include her and choosing to give her her own point of view.
Mhm. I mean, yes, poor Alice. I do agree that she's so naive and she's so over romanticized in her own head. And she's like writing this love story as she's trying to live it. And of course, that can't really happen. But I often think that the real struggles in life are the things that get us through. And I'm not sure that Abe and Jane could have lasted without Alice. I think Alice opens up something for them. I think that she puts something on the line for them in a way that's kind of critical and in a way that allows them to continue on. And so I think I don't like writing black and white characters. I don't see the world in black and white. And certainly on the page, I think it's like our job as authors to offer the gray area and to offer her not as a villain and not as, God bless Alice, but as someone and something in between that is just part of this, very long standing and complicated relationship. And I think, the thing about this book is that it is offering a romance that is in most ways very functional and very good. But also a 50-year romance is really hard. And I did want to offer, the truth in that. And Alice just happens to be a part of that.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the arc for Alice as well. Jenna and I were talking about how it was really interesting the way you showed how impactful the relationship with Abe was on Alice. Yes, Alice did pursue a married man, but at the same time, Abe kind of encouraged it, and there was definitely sort of an off-kilter power balance there, given that he was an older man and he was her professor. And I was struck, but not necessarily surprised by how the end of their relationship stopped her from writing. Um, and yet for Abe in his chapters, he tells Jane that Alice was no one to him.
Mhm.
I'd love to hear more about how you wrote this dynamic, how you wrote Alice's arc, and if there's anything that you wanted readers to take away from it.
I think it is a book about perspectives. I think that we get this particular perspective of the love story from Abe, the love story of Abe and Jane, which feels so like nourishing and rich and all of those things. And then we get Jane's perspective, which doesn't undermine that, but certainly offers a different way of seeing particular moments according to Jane. And then we get Max's perspective, which of course offers something entirely different. And I think Alice is one part of that too. And Alice and Abe, don't forget, are both writers. What they do is embody perspectives. And so it is a book about that. And I think Alice's way of seeing the relationship is pretty much juxtaposed to the way that Abe sees it. And that was really intentional to show the ways in which this 50-year relationship embodies so very much. And this one person sees like a million-year relationship with Abe. All she wants is him for the rest of her life. And he sees her as a real blip. And so it is a question of perspective. And I kind of wanted to play with that to break up this very long-standing epic love story.
I love that. And I think that another perspective that changed how I viewed some of these characters in a like, oh, how do all these pieces fit together is Max. Because he was one that I never quite knew how he was going to relate to the events. He is sort of an outlier to this epic love story.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Jane's struggle with her postpartum depression, her subsequent battle with cancer, which has really impacted their relationship. And yet, Max did have a strong maternal relationship with Bubby, and he has a somewhere in between, it seems, relationship with his father, but he really struggles to connect in general. And I really, it was such an interesting dynamic to watch that in comparison to these other people that have these strong connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about this trifecta dynamic. I am an only child. My parents I did not feel like an outlier in the relationship with my parents, but I can imagine what that would be like, and I've seen it play out in real life. And I think it's really interesting because I think that motherhood, I think parenthood can be really surprising. And I think that Jane and Abe were surprised by the ways in which Max surprised them. I think that Jane thought she was going to be more maternal than she was. I think she thought motherhood was going to be easier relative to um, the physicality of it, but I think also relative to her art and also relative to the relationship with Abe. And so I think it was important to say it's not always a clear path. Like these things can be really deeply, deeply surprising, and it can be an unnatural feeling to be a parent.
I think something that really fascinated me too about Max was that he has this really complicated relationship with art. And I'd love to hear you talk about whether that stemmed from his feelings about his parents, something else. What's going on there?
Yeah, I know. It is sort of like a perverted thing that he becomes an art dealer and doesn't take any interest in his mother's own work. But I mean, that's got to be intentional, right? I mean, I think that that's part of it. There's a way that there's like a real power struggle there, and that's how he wins. I have to say, like, Max for me was a true joy to write. I would say that there are no ways in which I align with him necessarily, in terms of the way that I love, in terms of the way that I have relationship with my parents. So a lot of what was so wonderful to write about Max was just kind of like the giving up of my own feelings on anything and the complete freedom to just create from scratch. And that's a really fun thing to do. And I really enjoy, I mean, I know Max. I feel like we all know we've all seen Max at a bar, we've all seen Max at a gallery, and he's very, very particular, and not just particular to New York. He's just a type. He's a trope. And tropes can be really wonderful to write for an author, I have to say.
I loved the ultimate sticking it to his parents of not just like leaving the art world and being like, I'm going to be an accountant or I'm going to be like an athlete. He was like, no, I'll be here, but not by you guys.
Yeah, totally. I know. The ultimate.
I I love the inclusion of art in this book. I love to get to be inside artists' minds and to see the way that they view the world and the way that their passions and creativities sort of shape their lives and those around them. And I really was struck by how Jane's mental state started to lift and her struggles start to sort of lighten when she returns to art. And I think of when B tells her just make art every day, even if it's a squiggle or a thumbprint, that idea of really connecting to art and making things and creating. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about Jane's connection to her practice of art.
I really believe that as far as creativity is concerned, motion is a virtue. So as long as you're doing a little something every day, you're battling writer's block, you're battling fatigue, you're battling not being able to do it. I mean, people have asked me over the years what I think about writer's block. And very early on in my career, I had a professor who said, I simply don't believe in it. If you're writing something, you are defeating writer's block. And so I sort of wanted to have that play out on the page. And I think that um, writing any form of art can be a real saving grace in our darkest times. And I think so often in my life, I've wondered why I'm feeling particularly anxious, why I feel unmoored. And it is 9 times out of 10 because I'm not creating. And I think that every person feels this way. It's not necessarily about art, it's about whatever your passion is, whether it's working out, whether it's cooking, whether it's cleaning, whether it's traveling, whether it's just working. And especially for mothers, I think this thing happens where we get into the spin cycle of life and we forget to do the things that bring us back into ourselves, into our bodies. And for Jane, certainly it was creating art. And it's kind of a reminder to me, it's a reminder to everyone to do the thing that empowers you and the thing that brings you peace.
I love that as a reminder. I think that's so important. Um, I think sort of connecting to Jane getting back into her art practice, she starts to feel ill not that long after, she's starting to work on her art again, starting to get some recognition. So on the one hand, I do understand a little bit why she put off seeing a doctor, but knowing her family history, I was also like, huh, why is she doing this? So what were sort of you thinking, what were you thinking about when you wrote this? Is she sort of putting off seeing someone until she basically has to see a doctor?
I think it's a thing that we do as people. We know the thing that is probably good for us, and we just um, or not the thing that's good for us. We know the thing that we need to do, and we just can't do it, especially after we've been through so much. I mean, I think that her postpartum is so severe, her sudden lack of faith in the person that she loved so deeply. She has a surprising lack of connection with her son. I think she feels like there can't be more. She can't have more. And so I think it's really self-preservation, although of course she's absolutely doing the opposite of preserving herself. She's undermining her own health. But I think for her at the time, it feels like all she can do to just keep on trucking without the kind of inevitable fall that will come with finding out what is wrong with her. I mean, I think that she so deeply knows what is wrong with her, and she just wants a couple more breaths without that spelled out for her.
And as I was reading it, I had this like visceral reaction to what comes next. Like the way that the universe always seems to work, that when you have one sort of awful thing happens, it feels like sometimes they just keep happening. And she goes right from this realization into Abe confessing his involvement with Alice. And she's so consumed by what is already in her mind that it's like she doesn't even hear him at first. And that is one of the scenes I think that stuck out to me the most in the entire book, was like just feeling what she feels in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the famous 1-2 punch, I think, that something happens and then something else happens. And I think sometimes like in a long-term relationship, and not even necessarily just a romance, but there's a way in which like a lot of really hard things happen at the same time, and the only way we can get past them is getting past all of them. Like you have to forgive everything to forgive anything. And I think that's the only way it works. Like, to be honest, I don't know. And I'm curious how you both feel about this, but I'm not sure she would have stayed with Abe if she hadn't gotten the cancer diagnosis. And I'm not sure what that would even have looked like. I think that they both all those things had to happen in order for anything to happen.
No, I agree with you. I think, the diagnosis and her illness put her in a position where she couldn't really leave. And I think that the way he cared for her through her illness is part of what kept them together.
Yeah, I think so much of a long-term relationship is like a response to tragedy, a response to hardship, because so much of life is hardship. And so, of course, it's not just about the unicorns and the butterflies. It's about getting past the immense hardships of life, which they do sort of beautifully, I think, as a
They
couple.
really do. They do. Um, I want to talk about the ending that you gave to Abe. I was so touched by it, meeting the dog named Jane in the park and feeding her ice cream. That to me truly felt like one of those magical, only in New York moments that you kind of have to live here to experience. And I'm curious what you think it is about Central Park in particular that allows for those kinds of moments, because it is one of those places where those things do happen and they happen a lot.
Mhm. Yeah, it is so storied. I feel like Central Park is so storied. And I don't know if it has something to do with the kind of juxtaposition of the park to the rest of the city, that like once we enter the park, we enter a different psychological and physiological state where we can kind of allow for more to happen because we've been so tightly wound just even getting to the park. But I also think that there's something that happens after tragedy where our eyes are opened to the possibility of life just a little bit more. And I've found like after the really hard moments in my life, there have been like moments of immense beauty just after. And I think that has everything to do with vulnerability and being open to the possibility of that. And so I wonder if like so much healing happens in Central Park, so many people are going to the park to literally heal, that magic happens more often because they are in that vulnerable and that open state and that kind of like open-hearted state. And so I kind of wonder if that's part of it. But I do think over the years, I've witnessed so many miracles in Central Park. People singing beautifully and children playing in a particular way, people being kind to each other, animals having particular relationships, all these things that feel so distinct. And I just feel like people go to the park and they release. And that's when the magic is can happen. We enable the magic to happen when we are that way.
I think that's so true and such a great way to put it. Um, the novel ends with Jane's perspective after her initial diagnosis and shortly after finding out about Alice, and she's considering her life and how making art was this necessary thing. But she's sort of thinking about how it wouldn't be the thing that saves her necessarily. She's thinking that maybe it's her family, maybe their love is what would save her. And I'm curious, like, do you think that love saved Jane in the end?
I think it's all connected. I think that she couldn't have been the artist she was without the immense wind at her back, which is Abe. I think that she couldn't have created the art that she created without the love that she has for her mother, without the love that she has for Bubby. I think that we can't experience love without love. I think we can't experience art without love. I think so much, and maybe this just has to do with like the schmaltziness of being a mother now, but um, we can't really do anything without love. Nothing means anything without love. So I think in the end, it is love that saves her, even though it is also art that saves her. Art is only art because she has this support system and she has this kind of like faith in her family, and hope. She has hope.
I agree. And as I was coming to the end, Jane has her ending and we feel peace with that. Abe has his ending and we feel peace. I was wondering, do you feel like Max is okay at the end? Because he is one that, again, as I was going through, we sort of left hanging on that and we can supply our own things. But as an author, sometimes I wonder, do you feel like your characters are okay now that you've closed the cover?
It's a tricky question. I've been asked it before, and I always want to say, what do you think? Because it sort of doesn't really matter what I think, but I do want to hear what you think. You go first. Do you
Okay.
think this is okay?
I think he gets there.
Yeah.
I think it takes him more time. I think he's got a lot going on, but I'd like to think that with the sort of the guidance he's had, eventually he'll get there.
I do think so too. I mean, I think it doesn't really matter what I think, but I do think that too. I think that Max will be as okay as Max can ever be, and that it's sort of not that it matters less, but that everybody sort of gets to their own version of peace by the end of this book. Even Alice in her way, even like tragic, tragic Alice. She she is okay in her version of okay. Jane is okay in her version of okay. She's gone. Abe is certainly as okay as anyone can be after losing the love of their life. And Max, I think, is as okay as Max can ever be. I mean, Max will never be Abe, um, but Max will be Max.
That's wonderful. Well, we're approaching the end of our time here, but there's a set of questions we always like to ask before we part ways, um, which is really, is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you'd like to tell the viewers here? And finally, what, if anything, do you hope readers take away from your book?
Um, I've been talking lately with some people about the unlikability of characters. It's a really interesting thing. It's not something that I ever really think about when I read, whether or not I like characters, or not, and whether or not I'd want to have lunch with them. It's just not something I care about so much. I'm more interested in whether or not I can relate to the characters, whether or not they teach me something about the world or about myself. And so I hope that people who read the book, I mean, of course, I hope that they love the book, but I also hope that they can maybe get past moments of feeling like Max isn't their favorite or Jane isn't their favorite, and rather see the book as an opportunity to kind of see the way that other people live and how we are all connected and we all can see ourselves in other people, and that sort of thing. So that's just something I've been thinking about lately, and feels kind of important. And as far as taking things away, from the book, in the very beginning of this conversation, when there was that beautiful little clip with set to music, I think about the way the world is so sad right now. It's so very, very hard. Like every day, it feels like it gets harder. And this book really is about love. It's about love in so many forms: the love of a friend, the love of a child, the love of a place, the love of art, the love of a partner. And so it feels like an important thing to read right now, or at least an important thing to think about in one's own life, because I think it's kind of like, as cliche, as it cheesy as it sounds, it's like the only thing that can save us.
I think that that is the absolute perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for
Thank
joining us
you
today,
so much.
Jessica. This was such a wonderful conversation. And thank you to all of the book club readers who joined us today as well. Come back and see us next month when we discuss our March book club selection, Broken Country. Thank you again, Jessica. This was
Thank you all. Thank you
wonderful.
for coming.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.